This is Love Your Work. On this show, we help you make it as a creative entrepreneur. Find your unique voice, find the right mindset to succeed, be the first to capitalize on new opportunities to make a living making your art. I'm David Cadavy. If you want to join us here on Love Your Work every Thursday, just hit subscribe on your podcast app. And to get your free creative productivity toolkit, sign up at cadavy.net/tools. Chris Bailey had a crazy thought. What if, after graduating from college, what if instead of getting a job, what if instead he spent an entire year learning everything he could about productivity? Chris actually followed that crazy thought. He did a project he called A Year of Productivity, carved out a year to learn about productivity. And that was 5 years ago. Chris has now written 2 books. First, The Productivity Project, and now his new book is Hyperfocus, How to Be More Productive in a World of Distraction. Chris has a unique approach to productivity advice. He mixes scientific research with his own, quite frankly, sometimes wacky personal experimentation. He once purposefully made himself bored for an hour a day with tasks such as watching paint dry or reading the iTunes terms and conditions. And as we go into 2019, we're all thinking about how we can be better in many things. This conversation will give you fresh thinking for how you keep yourself productive and focused. We're going to talk about how did Chris make the decision to turn down job offers and dedicate himself to studying productivity. The more confident that you can be in your decisions, the more focused you can be. And Chris's regret minimization technique will help you frame your big decisions. Also, how does Chris separate the scientific research behind staying productive and focused from the hype around being productive and focused? The better you can separate the wheat from the chaff, the easier you can find what works for you. And how can you start forming your own unique approach to productivity and focus? And how can you start that today? There are already clues that you can look at to start being more focused than ever. Chris is going to share those clues with you. And this is the time of year you think about being more focused, because this is the time of year you start thinking about the type of person that you want to be. And sometimes that person that you want to be, sometimes it's not always so clear. But I personally think that creative work is a perfect way to discover that person and to become that person. Because as soon as you put a goal in your mind, as soon as you find something that you want to achieve, as soon as you answer your own call to greatness, you start becoming a better version of yourself. Because then suddenly you aren't beating yourself up over wasting time and energy. You aren't beating yourself up for watching too much Netflix or spending too much time on Facebook or getting too upset about some news item or getting impatient waiting in line at the coffee shop. You stop getting upset about those things because distractions suddenly stop being the source of pleasure that they once were. I mean, admit it, it feels good to be indulgent or angry or impatient from time to time. And distractions aren't just a source of guilt anymore once you start answering your own call to greatness, because that guilt itself becomes yet another distraction. So once you answer your own call to greatness, distractions become something in the way. They've suddenly become an obstacle that stands in the way of you becoming the person you want to be. And so you start creating, and you don't always know why you're creating. You don't always know what you're creating, but you're doing it anyway. And you're looking for that tingle of curiosity lighting up your brain, because that tingle of curiosity, that is the one force in this world that is more powerful than any distraction possibly could be. And before you know it, you've created a body of work. And that body of work stands there as a representation of you, of who you once were, who you've become, who you dream of being in the future. So how do I know this? Because I've lived it right here on this podcast. 3 years ago when I started, I didn't know what my plan was. I didn't know what I'd learn. Over the past 3 years, you've been right here. You've seen how I've changed and grown. You've learned the very same lessons that I've learned from all these great guests. You've seen how those lessons have helped me publish books and believe in myself as a creative entrepreneur and to find my voice And you've heard my own reflections on these lessons in the mini episodes. And I'm willing to bet I know from knowing many of you, you have grown too. All of you have. And this growth is made possible by you and the other listeners. I could not make this show without you. As much as I like to think that I would if nobody was listening, I need you to be there as a listener to motivate me to make the show, to tell me how it's going. And even more, I couldn't make this show without the Patreon supporters. So this right here is an ad-free, sponsor-free episode. The Patreon supporters are bringing this to you right now. Every little bite of audio going into every one of your ears around the world was paid for by Patreon supporters for this episode. They paid for the production costs, the sound people making the audio crisp. They paid for the hosting, the computers all around the world delivering this audio right to your device. They paid for the publishing assistants, the people who upload the audio and the metadata, and they get it out on all the platforms, whether that's Apple Podcasts or YouTube or Spotify or Amazon Echo, now even Pandora. It's all paid for by the Patreon supporters. So, as the world finishes one more revolution around the sun, as you think about who you want to be for this coming revolution around the sun, and the one after that, and the one after that, as you think about that, start thinking about putting your money where your mind is. And your mind is on this show. You listen to it every week. You look forward to Thursday morning for your fix of Love Your Work. So why not double down on that? Why not sink in a little further? You're getting value from the show. Give a little value back. And you'll see that value come back to you even more many times over. So become a Patreon supporter. You'll be a bigger part of the show. Your money will be where your mind is. You'll go further down that path to being the person you want to be. Go to patreon.com/Katavi to learn more and sign up. That is patreon.com/KA, D as in David, A, V as in Victor, Y. Here's Chris Bailey. I'm here with Chris Bailey, and Chris, part of your story is that you took an entire year off to experiment with productivity, to do research on productivity, and that seems like a big leap. Why did you do that?
I've always been kind of weird in that way. Some people have normal interests. I feel like cooking and maybe business and sports, but there's been a weird part of me that's been always curious about this idea of productivity. Not productivity in like the cold corporate sense where it's all about efficiency, but productivity in just doing what we set out to do and doing what we say that we're going to do. And it's been a curiosity of mine for about a decade, up until the point at which I graduated college, university here in Canada, a few years back many years back at this point. And I was in the fortunate position because I'd worked a few jobs up to that point where I'd received a few full-time job offers. But I thought, if there's a time when I should actually explore and experiment and research this thing that I'm actually curious about more than, and that project would have more meaning than these other jobs that I had. I thought it was them. And so I declined them. I figured, okay, in Canada, you can defer your student loans a little bit. So I had about $24,000 of student loans, but I also had about $12,000 saved up at that point, enough of a financial runway to live off of my savings for a year, defer the loans, and dive deep into exploring this idea of productivity. And it was a gamble. It really was. I had no audience at the start of the project. Everybody thought I was a freaking idiot because I declined these well-paying jobs to start essentially a blog. But then the blog started gaining a following. People said, okay, this guy's, he's going all in. Let me figure out what he's about. And that led into a book deal at the end of that project. And then that book did well. And so now I've been fortunate to come out with a second book about the science of attention and to continue nerding out about this topic.
Okay, this is something I definitely want to dig into a little bit.
Yeah.
So it sounded like you had some other alternatives. You had some other job offers on the table.
Jobby jobs. Yeah.
Jobby jobs. And so was this a difficult decision for you at all? How
Yeah.
did you parse this decision?
Oh, hell yeah. It was like, because I'm pretty risk averse. It might not seem, I think we get attached to our stories a little bit, but, it might not sound like I'm risk averse, but I hate risk. I try to minimize the risk in a lot of different parts of my life. And it's tough to make a decision when you know that the decision, it feels like the right one at that guttural and visceral level, but yet you have everybody in your life telling you that, man, like, are you stupid? Like you're giving up a job at so and so a place. So the one was with the government, one was in the private sector, other one was in the private sector, and so. It looks like a foolish decision, but I think the riskier thing, because I look at risk from a more holistic kind of perspective, I think a riskier thing would have been to not minimize the amount of regret that I would have felt by making that decision and taken one of the jobs, because I would have regretted for the rest of my life not doing that, not making that jump. And so, it was a tough decision, but I couldn't really imagine doing anything else. The one person I will say, I always like to give her credit for this. While I'll bash everybody else in my life, but my now fiance, she was, going to school at the time. We'd been together for just a year or two at that point, if I remember correctly. And she said, like, you know what? If you don't do this, you'll regret doing this for forever. I won't stop hearing about it, oh, I should have taken the jump. I should have taken the leap. And so she was the only one that supported me. And luckily she still supports me through this day, not financially, but emotionally.
Mostly because she didn't want to hear you complain about it for the rest of her life.
Yeah. She's like doing her own minimizing the regret calculation, I feel.
Okay. So other people in your life were, advising you against this.
Yeah.
And did you feel like, oh, I'm crazy for doing this? What sort of internal processes were going on?
I felt like, yeah, especially at the beginning, because, when I started the project, I tapped into the network that I had. I worked in HR and, because of that business background that I have. And so I asked everybody in my network, like, if I'm doing this, am I throwing away this career that I've built up to this point? Because I worked in the private sector all throughout college and in university, hopefully being productive during that time too. And it was kind of the one, decision that I've made where I made it and I thought, I don't care what anybody thinks. I don't care what anybody says, because if I'm wrong, it'll cost me a year of my life, but then I won't have any regrets at the end of it. But if I'm right, the upside of making this decision is so much greater than the upside of taking one of those jobs where I'd still be, working behind a computer monitor, where I'd still be, in a cubicle somewhere in a government building, making a good, and by the way, this is not to discount people in those roles, but I'm someone who loves structure in my life, and I love having the control over that structure more so than I love the structure in the first place. And so I did feel like a fool, especially at the start of that project, because it started in May, and throughout the first few months, May, June, July, August, September, there was a lot. There weren't many people who visited the website. I have to be honest with you. There was a bit of media pickup at the first, like, oh, this guy's a fool. Let's see how this project turns out. But, besides that, not many people visited. And that was kind of a low point during the project. But after that point, there was a project I conducted, I think at the end of September, where I watched 296 TED Talks over the course of a week, 70 hours of TED Talks to play and experiment with information retention and how things like taking breaks affect our attention and our focus. And toward that, no organization other than TED wanted to interview me for their official blog. And they published this long form interview. And that was the point when the project began gaining traction. People started to notice. People thought, oh, TED is covering this guy. Maybe he's worth paying attention to. And that, I started to dive in even deeper at that point, conducting more experiments and writing more, and I haven't really stopped since that point. And so, you do feel like a fool when you make a decision, and it doesn't really turn out at the start. It's kind of the dip, which, a colleague of mine, Hours in the Productivity Space, Seth Godin, talks about, where, things, you feel the initial excitement, but then there's the dip after that point. But once you get past the dip, and once you perseverate past that point, there are often things to be gained on the other side. So yeah, to answer the question, I did feel like a fool at the beginning of the project, but luckily, the risk turned into a reward.
And so you were about 3 or 4 months in to the project when you started getting traction. And, that's actually a pretty short dip. But what was your day-to-day like up until that point?
It was like first and foremost a research project. And so, the day-to-day, it was reading books about productivity to disseminate those lessons to my readers.
As a research project, was there a main question in your mind, or was it just general?
Yeah, is there a secret? How do we accomplish what we set out to do? Is there one thing that we need to do, or is it more of a complex web, this constellation of ideas and habits that we need in order to live a more productive life? It was nobody had really done a deep dive into that world of productivity. There are all these consultants running around, these old white gray-haired consultants running around, saying, oh, I have this 10-step system, but they haven't really done a deep dive into productivity. There's a lot of corporate leaders who, lead people to become more productive, but they haven't really dug deep into the science behind it. So, it was looking at the books, but it was talking to these experts to see which ones were full of shit and which ones actually knew what they were talking about. And I found, that sometimes the people who call themselves experts, I'm not I like to call myself a productivity expert. So I'm guilty of this to some extent too. But sometimes the people who make their living as an expert, they don't necessarily deserve as much credit as the people who I consider the real experts, the people who study things like intentionality and procrastination for a living, whose name never really adorns the front cover of a book, but yet their work influences all the books that are out there in the first place. And so, it started by, okay, I'm going to look at the books, but then that led me to look at the actual research behind productivity, behind intention and attention and things like meditation and taking breaks and the science behind that. Because ultimately, and this is something that I didn't expect to find, I thought I would kind of sift through a lot of hacks, but then I thought, okay, if I'm actually going to do a good job of researching this topic, I have to look a bit deeper. Because that surface level bullshit, there's a lot of it out there. There's a lot of articles like, oh, Richard Branson does so-and-so every single morning, and this is why he's a billionaire, which is why you should keep your couch in the living room, or whatever the hell these listicles like to say. But I think that the answer has to be rooted in science. It has to be deeper than that. It has to have that deeper connection to who we are, to how our brain is wired, and to how the world is wired too. And so, it started... okay, I'm going to look at the hacks and the tactics, but it really then morphed into looking at the science.
Mm-hmm. That's one thing that's very clear to me when I read your books, is that you clearly enjoy diving into the science. You do cite a lot of studies, but then at the same time, you also have some personal experience there. And this is something that I struggle with when I think about writing about productivity or creative productivity specifically, and also working on my own productivity, is that you know, how heavily can you rely upon scientific papers to tell you everything that you need to know? How do you think about that separation between experience and scientific research?
I think it really does depend on the research because not all research is created equal. You have kind of the meta-analyses where they sum up hundreds of studies. There are great meta-analyses where, people say they read, hundreds of articles about a topic, but sometimes all you need to do is read one, the one that's the meta-analysis of how caffeine influences our mental and our physical performance, how nicotine influences our mental and physical performance, on grit. You don't need to read a book on grit. You can read, I can think of one or two studies that you can read on grit that will tell you all you need to know about the topic. But that was the fascinating thing about this book, Hyperfocus, is, look, I don't know if you've ever watched one of those crime shows where somebody's like, they're solving a murder. And so they have a big map in their office, and attached to the map is string attached to pictures, to newspaper clippings and articles and memos. Mm-hmm. That was like the state of my office with the big ass whiteboard that I have in here, but with studies about our attention and how our attention works. And what you find with a topic like that, creativity is a great example of this too. It's very difficult to measure creativity in a laboratory. A lot of the times people just, they find, okay, how many uses can you find for this matchbox? And the more uses that somebody comes up with, the more creative they are on a certain scale. Measuring divergent and convergent thinking in that way. But what you will find, especially with attention, and what I like to do is focus on the research that's in situ. And so, in situation. And so instead of saying like, okay, come to a lab and we'll measure how you multitask and how often you switch between things on your computer. What these studies do is they analyze somebody in their natural habitat, in front of their office computer when they're checking their email or on conference calls, and then, clicking around on social media at the same time. These are the best studies and the ones that I found to be the most illuminating and valuable. So something that I did over the course of writing Hyperfocus, I did this a few times. I flew out to Microsoft, their research campus in Redmond, because, and believe it or not, the company conducts a ton of research into our attention. They have thousands of researchers there because Bill Gates always believed in doing research for research's sake. And so, they have scores of researchers there who examine. Luckily, they have a great sampling of people at Microsoft, to use as their guinea pigs. They look at how they work. They look at how often they switch between things. They look at how often they multitask. They look, maybe more important than all these factors, at how these things influence their focus and their productivity and how stressed they are. They, instead of saying like, okay, how stressed do you feel? They'll strap a heart rate monitor to measure people's actual heart rate variability, which is a much accurate measure of stress than somebody just saying, yeah, I feel really stressed out today, man. And so I think it's worth focusing on studies like these over the ones that are conducted in the laboratories. And so that's something that I try to do because, frankly, you can have a viewpoint and find some studies that support it.
Right.
The more difficult thing to do is to look at the studies that are out there and combine those together and piece them together and use it and build that murder map of, what's happening to our attention today, starting with the studies and working backwards instead, not forwards, to how we should act differently and getting a read on the way things are. And, doing that, you learn some things that make you uncomfortable, like that sometimes interruption is a good thing. Like that sometimes we can, be more productive as a team when we're constantly interrupted. Sometimes work is hyper collaborative in that way. Sometimes enabling a distractions blocker makes us more stressed out than it does otherwise. And so, but you gain a better and more complete understanding of what things are actually like instead of how you want them to be. And I think that's everything when it comes to topics like this.
Mm-hmm. And you do a lot of personal experimentation as well. I remember You talking about being in isolation for 10 days, or forcing, the one I loved was you forcing yourself to be bored for an hour a day for like 30 different days, including activities like watching paint dry or watching your turtle swim in her tank. And
reading the iTunes terms and conditions.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, through the course of your own personal experimentation, do you very often run into phenomena where you aren't able to find research that supports your observations?
Yeah. Yeah. To come up with a couple of examples, what we wear, there was a period of time where I mixed up what I wore every single day to see how that influenced my productivity. And I didn't really find much, in that study. There were other ones, the TED experiment is a good one. I had the chance to piece together a lot of different ideas around, things like the ideas that I was consuming. A lot of those had to do with wellness and productivity and creativity, but maybe not necessarily from a practical standpoint, maybe more that idea standpoint. There were other experiments like, I'm just trying to think, like eating only Soylent for a month, which was, the struggle to, I didn't actually make it through that one. Because I just love food so much, man. It's like my greatest pleasure in life. I was just in New York yesterday. I had like a quick interview. I flew there and I was in the city for less than 24 hours, and I had Halal Guys, that wonderful street meat vendor, twice.
I have a friend who really loves them,
What's that? You
I have a friend who's just obsessed with
Have you had Halal Guys?
Yeah, I have. It's good.
You don't seem convinced that it's great.
It's good.
That might be a sticking point for the rest of it. What don't you like about Halal Guys?
The thing is, I eat a very, very plain diet.
Yeah. Beans and rice every day.
No. Definitely no beans or rice. No carbohydrates. And so it makes it
you wouldn't like Halal Guys.
Yeah. Well, it makes it tricky. It's good. I like the meat part. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a rice base, and so
I like it all. By the way.
Oh yeah,
I like it all. It's just I just don't. Yeah.
Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. I understand now. I'm not as mad at you as I was a few minutes ago.
We'll be able to make it through.
Yeah, I think we'll make it through this interview. We'll get, holding hands. We'll get through this interview together, man. But it's just like one example of my weakness, which is food. In fact, most of the experiments that I failed and, often failed to glean lessons from, surrounded food, lowering my body fat from 17 down to 10%. I hated my life during that experiment because I deprived myself of some of the very foods that I loved so much.
But did you ever find things that like really worked for you that then when you looked through the research, you weren't able to, find anything that supported it?
Not really. No, it's and it's a fascinating question. I've never really thought about that, and I've never been asked that. I can't really think of anything because there's always an angle.
I mean, it surprises me. This might be a way that you and I differ in like the way that we approach things, and hopefully we'll still be able to get through the interview without being at each other's throats during it. But I love this idea by Nassim Taleb of lecturing birds how to fly. That there's an illusion that scientific research or universities or institutions develop our ideas, when in fact it's a little bit like a physics professor sometimes lecturing a bird on physics and how to fly. And I think about examples like the guy who ran the first under 4-minute mile didn't have very much time, so he was running very intensely for short bursts, and it was many years later before anybody discovered that high intensity interval training was more effective per unit of time than steady state training. And so it seems like there, especially as somebody who experiments so much with productivity, I guess I'm surprised to find out that you didn't find some sort of things that, wow, this really works well for me. I can't find any research that supports this. Yeah. And who knows if this will be something that we figure out later on.
Yeah. This was, Oh, so you're thinking of things that worked for me that wasn't supported by the research.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that research, research can only move so fast. You know,
Oh,
we have a world that moves
very slow.
That moves so fast, and for a study to even be done, somebody has to have some kind of an observation or a hypothesis, probably from their own personal experience, that they're then able to formalize into research and then say, okay, this works across a population. By the way, which is another another limitation. This works across a population, or it doesn't. And so you would think that, especially somebody experimenting all the time, that you would find some things that you weren't able to find research for.
Like meditation comes to mind as an example of that, because if you look at for studies on how meditation influences our productivity. First of all, productivity is a very difficult subject of study, because what does productivity mean in the first place? It's especially when we do knowledge work for a living, when it's how much we accomplish. Usually these studies rely on subjective measures of productivity. So somebody says, "Oh yeah, I was 8 out of 10 productive today, but I had less sleep," and so you look at fascinating things like that. So there are things, discoveries that, like meditation, I find it allows me to accomplish more, invariably. I write about 47 or 40% more words when I have an active meditation practice. I'm able to see more meaning around me. I'm able to dive deeper into my experiences. But there's very little research on how meditation influences our productivity directly. In fact, this is actually kind of a curious idea in and of itself. Is there's very little research on how many things influence our productivity, but you kind of then I think one of the things that worked well for the experiments that I conduct is that they're anything but scientific. Like most of them would never pass a traditional ethics committee, for most reputable institutions.
10 days of isolation, that would probably be a tough one.
I don't think that would fly. Maybe I could try pitching it to a few local universities. But they're kind of a frame that I use to talk about the research on a topic. So meditation is a good example of that. There's very little research on how meditation influences our productivity directly.
Really?
But there's research on how meditation helps us focus. There's research on how it allows us to resist distractions in the moment and practice more meta-awareness and notice that our mind is wandering and that we're veering off track. And so you can kind of say, make the more abstract connection that there's no science behind the fact that meditation directly helps us become more productive, but there is this fascinating science behind that. It lets our mind wander to more productive places. It lets us gain more working memory capacity to use to process information on the fly. And this is this is something else that's worth mentioning is the experiments weren't scientific. They're highly subjective whenever I conduct one of them, but at the same time, it's personal productivity. And I think this is something that, the 5, the 10-step systems out there really, really miss the mark on, is that because it's personal, we have to take the advice that works for us and I think leave the rest on the table. Some system that we blindly follow or some expert's advice that we blindly follow without really questioning its efficacy in the first place. I really think we should question those ideas and really take what works for us and leave the rest, because our work is different compared to everybody else. Mm-hmm. We're unique. We have our own lives. Some of us have families. Some of us live alone. Some of us work in a factory. Some of us are programmers and do knowledge work for a living. So I think that's something else that is worth considering too, is that it's personal.
Yeah, and this touches on what I was thinking about as far as the limitations of studies, is that it's across a population or some sample size, and that is personal. And so some things are going to work for some people or some things are going to not work for others. And there was a guest that I had previously, Manish Sethi, who made an interesting observation, which was that correlation is not causation when you're doing a study like this with a large group of people. But when you're an individual, when you have an N of 1, correlation is just about all that matters. Does that make sense to you? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. Yeah, I love that. And I would go a bit further and say, we tend to look all around us for advice. And sometimes like a good prod in the right direction is always helpful. That's why I like to write my books, because I frame them as like, here are a few things that you can do in order to focus deeper. Or here are some things you can do to become more productive. You don't have to follow some system. Like take what works for you. But I think at the same time, we have so many data points in our own life. If you want to become more focused, look at when you were focused in the past and think, okay, what conditions were true that created that state of focus for me? Maybe I was on a deadline. Maybe I was doing work that was sufficiently challenging and just at my level of skills and expertise. And so I was able to enter into what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi calls a flow state, where you become one with what you're doing, and time seems to flow by so quickly. You look up at the clock and you think 15 minutes have gone by, but 2 hours have gone by. When looking back, when were you the happiest? What was true in those cases? When did you have the most energy? Were you letting your mind wander a little bit? Did your attention have a chance to rest? And so I think that's something else that we need to bring sort of that mindfulness of the past to what conditions existed previously that led to us feeling or behaving a certain way. When we're more productive, when we feel more focused, when we're able to enter into that hyper-focused state where we accomplish in a given hour what sometimes takes us an entire day or an entire afternoon. We have enough data, we just don't really look at it.
Yeah, and I think that building the skill of making some kind of hypotheses and making changes and then tracking it and seeing what works and what doesn't, I think that's a valuable skill. And that's actually something that I think that I'm curious about with you, and I think might be useful for our listeners is, when you say that when I meditate, I write 40% more words, how do you come out with that outcome? Is that a study that is designed with a certain period of time? How are the words tracked? How do you come to that conclusion? What are the nuts and bolts of coming up with that information?
Yeah, so I actually charted that over the course of writing this last book. And so, whenever I write a book, I always have a word count. And so I print off a chart every couple of, not every day, but every couple of days in my office. So I have kind of the trend line of how many words I'll need to write in order to meet a deadline. And then I'll have the actual word count line, which dances around that trend line. It's usually on top of it, which is good because then I'm writing, I'm ahead of my deadline. And so maybe I've time to do a bit more research or deeper interviews into something. But I'll also chart, that word count around other experiences in my life. Most of them don't prove to be significant for me. But meditation, I find to be something where on days where I meditate for 15 minutes or more, I have a daily 30-minute Vipassana meditation practice. But I say that, but it doesn't happen every single day. But I usually find the attention to sit for about 15 minutes. And so I find that on those days, in charting this daily update, I kind of got curious about it in the process. I looked back on all the meditation data, and I found that when I meditated that day, that I wrote about 40% more thereabouts. I think it was either a bit under or a bit over, but it's fascinating, and I think it speaks to an idea that kept coming up over the course of writing Hyperfocus, which is that, the state of our attention determines the state of our lives. And so if we're distracted in each moment, those moments accumulate day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year to build up to make a life that feels distracted and like it doesn't have a direction and we feel overwhelmed in. But on the other hand, if we have greater control over our attention, which mindfulness and meditation help us get to, we're able to manage our attention so that we focus on things that are more productive in the moment. We focus on things that are more meaningful in the moment. You know, whether it's a conversation with a loved one or just, you know, being with our cup of coffee in the morning or a shower in the morning and really deeply experiencing that thing instead of having our mind be on the next thing that we want to do after that point. And so I think, you know, it speaks to that idea, you know, that crux of the book, which is that the state of our attention determines the state of our life. And what impacts the quality of our attention is how much control we have over it. And, you know, there are a lot of different ways to take control, which is why it's a book-length book. But meditation is one of those where, you know, and so I don't think it's really a surprise that lets me write that much more. But, you know, if I'm interested in something, I think it's kind of an attitude as it relates to productivity, is productivity means so much. You know, not productivity in like I was saying, the cold corporate sense, but the sense of just doing what we set out to do. You know, accomplishing what we intend to do, that it is worth reflecting on these days when we're able to write more, when we're able to process our experiences more deeply, when we're more productive than on other days in ways that we actually want to be more productive. And, you know, I should preface that, you know, semi-interesting finding by saying that, you know, I'm not saying that the words that I wrote are good. You know, it could be that I wrote 1,000 words instead of like 600 or however the math works out. And they were like garbage. You know, the Gettysburg Address was 400 and some words, for example. But I think it really does support this idea that the state of our attention matters almost more than anything else as it relates to our productivity today.
Well, that's something I was wondering about, the word count thing. So it sounds like you have an ongoing way that you measure word count, and then you also have other ways of tracking data that you can then compare to that word count. And I know for myself, like I have a project right now that I'm thinking will probably end up around 10,000 words. I've probably written 50,000 words on this project. So
you overshot it a little bit.
but I don't think that, I mean, I still think it'll end up being 10 or 12,000 words. It's just that for me, that it takes that much writing to end up with something good. So when you write and you have a word count that you're going for, are you one of these writers that sits there and plods along and makes sure that every sentence and word is right, or are you like me and you just barf things out and then you try to clean it up?
You know, with the two books that I've written, like you start with kind of the book proposal, and so in the book proposal for each of them, because you know going through traditional publishers with Penguin Random House for both of them, there was a detailed table of contents in each of the proposals, which was about 20,000 words. No, probably about 10,000 words of just the framework and the structure that the words will fit inside. And so once I have that, because I have kind of, once I have that, what I do is I decide on a mix between how many stories I want to include and how much practical, tactical, scientific stuff that I want to include. Because I think this is something that, you know, a lot of writers in the productivity space don't think enough about. You know, they have a book that could essentially be a long article. And so what they do is they fill it with a bunch of anecdotes, which, you know, pad the book and get them to that word count that they promised their publisher. And so that's kind of the starting point. Once I have the amount of words that I want to write, the first book that I wrote my target was 80,000. This second book, the target was 70,000. My editor will tell you, like, I told Chris, like, he could write whatever the hell he wants and I'll put it out there. But you know, I like having the structure. So what I do is then at that point, because I had about 20 I think about 25,000 words of pure research notes that were gleaned from all the studies that I was looking at and kind of piecing those together, is I had those broken down and kind of really, really roughly distributed inside of that framework that I was working from, that detailed table of contents. And then I looked at the relative word count. I don't know if this is interesting to anybody, but maybe it is. The relative word count of each of those chunks of research that fit into each of the chapters. And so if, one of those chapters had about 3,000 words of research notes and another had 6,000 words of research notes, I would, times that by whatever multiple to get to 70,000 words. And then that would be the word count for that specific chapter, so that the density of the information was approximately the same that spanned across the entire book. And so I think this is, it's something that, where you have a larger project like this, where, there's kind of there's the trees in the forest. You can kind of look at that ground level. Okay, what am I actually going to write about? But then you have the broader landscape of the book itself, the architecture of the book itself. And I think controlling for the density there of information, and just kind of having a rough target so if you're back on track. I don't like meticulously look at every sentence, but I don't really go back and edit an incredible lot afterwards, because simply because the book is pretty well thought out. There's a detailed table of contents, there's the research, you mash those together, and then you have you combine that with the thoughts in your head and the thoughts that you think your way through when you're actually writing the thing, and then you have hopefully a product that you're proud of at the end.
So if I understand that right, you're kind of tracking the amount of notes relative to the amount of the length of that chapter to determine the sort of information density of that chapter, or the research density of that chapter.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say the book had 2 chapters, and in the first chapter, I'd made 1,000 words of research notes. And in the second chapter, I'd made 2,000 words of research notes. When you got the finished book, the first chapter might be 20,000 words, and the second chapter might be 40,000 words to make that combined word count of 60,000, but, spread across about 10 chapters or so, with very much more jagged numbers.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that is interesting. Okay, so it's been fun.
I hope that's interesting. Like, it's one of those things, like I've never really explained this before, this writing process that I have, but I personally find it really, like, I try to be really thoughtful about, not just the granular ideas in the books that I write, but also the broader architecture of a book, because I can really, really appreciate a book that is well laid out, and well thought out, and it has that uniform density. Because ultimately, like, the editor that I work with at Penguin, he's king shit. Like, he knows his stuff. And he's a better writer than I'll ever be. He edits novels. He edits books like this. He edits popular psychology books. He edits everything under the sun. And so I want to get it in the best shape that I possibly can. And I don't want him fixing shit. I want him to push on the limits. I want to write at the limits of my ability, at the edge of my ability, so that when he gets the words, he's able to push it even further and bring his unique taste to it as well.
Well, it shows, because your book is not one of those books that's an article with filler in it. It's very dense. It has a nice mixture of, a lot of times when scientific studies are being cited again and again, I tend to get bored. But that's not the case with your book. It is well woven with your experiences and your own observations from your own experimentation. And we're almost out of time, and we haven't even really gotten to the book too much. So can you give it, which is entirely my fault, can we get to or can you describe the difference between hyperfocus and scatterfocus, which is something that I found really interesting?
Yes. So this is, to give we have Cole's notes up in Canada. I guess you have Cliff's notes, in the US. Okay. Is there an equivalent in Colombia?
I don't know. I still just get all my books are still in English so far most of the time. But I will say there seems to be a thriving industry of making summaries of best-selling books on Kindle, not by Cliff Snorkel. So
yeah, there's like that cottage industry of like the crappy cover, and it'll say like, summary of Chris Bailey's Hyperfocus. And it always has like a 2-star rating on Amazon from one person who bought that instead of the actual book. But it's essentially a book about managing our attention deliberately, because so often we allow the world around us to have control over our attention. And, there are kind of these two attentional modes that I gleaned from the research. There's hyperfocus, which is when we bring our complete deliberate attention to one thing. And to best get there, we have to do some things that we know how to do, but some things that we might not. Setting stronger intentions at the beginning that are more specific, but also in some curious ways, setting what are called implementation intentions, eliminating distractions, which we can do in some fun and curious ways, and then bringing our attention back gently when it wanders to think about something else. So that's kind of a state of deliberate focus where we choose what we focus on before we find ourselves focusing on something, and where, we kind of regain a bit of control of our attention from the world around us. And the corollary of hyperfocus is what I like to call scatter focus, which is a state of deliberate mind wandering. And so mind wandering, it's a huge pain in the ass when we're trying to focus, when our intention is to focus. But when our intention is to be more creative and come up with more creative insights, deliberate mind wandering is in a league all of its own. And especially with planning, chances are, if you think back to when your best idea hits you, you're not focused on anything. Maybe you're, taking a shower, for an example, and your mind wanders to a few of the dots in your mind that you then connect in that moment, and then boom, you get this brilliant light bulb insight that strikes you from out of the blue. And it's because of the fascinating places and the downright productive and creative places that our mind wanders to. We wander to think about the future 48% of the time when we let our mind wander deliberately. We think about the present about a third of the time, and the past only about 12% of the time. But what happens when we bounce between these three mental destinations? We bounce from the present to the future, to the past, to the present, to the past, to the future. We connect these three temporal destinations to unearth these insights that we would never arrive at otherwise, that require these logical leaps in thinking. And so, we tend to think of our attention as this thing of whether we're focused or, how intense we're focused on something. But what you'll find in practice is it's this beautiful dance between the focused and the unfocused mode of our mind that leads to us becoming more productive and creative.
And as people are listening to this, they are thinking about their new year. This episode will be coming out around then. What would be your recommendations to leave with our listeners if they are looking to have a very focused 2019?
Yeah. Look at what applications and what websites and distractions in your life actually add meaning, and which ones actually make you happy. Because we tend to focus, our attention is fascinating. We gravitate to focus on anything that is pleasurable. We also focus on anything that is threatening, and we focus on anything that is new and novel. And when something is a combination of all three things, we tend to really focus on it. But what is pleasurable and threatening and novel in the moment is sometimes, it's always more stimulating than what we truly want to be doing, but it doesn't necessarily always make us happier. And it doesn't necessarily make our lives more meaningful. And so what I would encourage folks to do is kind of do a detox, a spring cleaning of the things that occupy your attention in your life. Look through the apps on your phone and ask, okay, do I get genuine enjoyment from the social media apps that are on here? Or which ones do I get genuine enjoyment from? Look at the websites you visit out of habit, the news websites, the other websites that update you about the state of the world. Do those things provide you with lasting meaning and happiness? Or is it the people in your life that these things kind of get in the way of? And so I think that, it's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately over the course of writing this book and beyond is, we're so stimulated by default. And it's because we have this novelty bias embedded within our brain's prefrontal cortex, where our brain actually rewards us with a hit of dopamine for every new and novel thing on which we direct our focus. And so because of that, we're at this very high level of stimulation, but also because of that, we're less thoughtful, we're less insightful, we're less deliberate about what we do and what we think and what we say and what we piece together in our mind. And so I would encourage folks to do that is, look at what you pay attention to over the course of the day. Look at where your happiness and meaning comes from, and really reflect, do those things match up? Because when we focus on what's stimulating, that isn't always the case.
Great advice for having a focused 2019. Also, check out Chris's books. The Productivity Project, the new one is Hyperfocus. Where else can they find more of you, Chris?
So those are in any bookstore. My site is called alifeofproductivity.com if you want to check that out. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy we got through this together, man.
Yeah. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Is Love Your Work helping you find your unique creative voice? Does it bring you the inspiration and motivation you need to become the creator and human you want to be? If so, please be a part of making this a special and nourishing and thoughtful show. Support the show on Patreon. You'll be an even bigger part of this show than you already are. If you contribute just a coffee a month, you'll be helping support the hosting and production of Love Your Work. Everyone has some unique creative gift to offer the world. Together, we can give people the tools they need to bring that work into the world. The world will be better off for it. Visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/Cadavy. This is a different kind of model for supporting the work you love. The choice is yours. Vote with your dollars, put your money where your mind is, and keep Love Your Work going. Visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/Cadavy. As a thank you, you'll get early access, bonus content, and a discount on Love Your Work merchandise. Learn more at patreon.com/Cadavy. That's patreon.com/KA, D as in David, A, V as in Victor, Y. Love Your Work is brought to you in part by our Patreon supporters, such as mini sponsor Roxana Maynard of Agility Alchemist at agilityalchemist.com, and top supporters such as Jeffrey Mason and Vitas Pankavicius. This has been Love Your Work, and I'm David Cadavy. The theme music for this show is At Sea by Dorena from the album About Everything and More by arrangement with Deep Elm Records at deepelm.com. Love Your Work is a production of Cadavy, Inc.